This is the best of the Paul Finebaum podcast.
Bruce Feldman, always great to join with the Fox Sports college football analyst. His latest, the QB, critically acclaimed Boston Globe over the weekend, a rave review, as so many others around the country have. And Bruce, it's always great to check in with you on, I'm sure, is a warm day out in California. Hopefully you're out there and not on the East Coast.
Yeah, no, Paul, there's no snow out here, so it's good. It's always fun to look at it on TV. It looks pretty, but I grew up in it, and I don't miss it. So. Yeah,
I know you did. Let's start with your book. We talked about it a couple of months ago, but I mentioned the reviews, and I know as a writer, you can't control what other people think, but it seems like, at least from what I can tell, almost everyone has loved this book.
Yeah, it's been great. You know, as you know, you kind of live in a vacuum, and you don't know how people are going to respond to anything or whatever. What's been exciting for me, just kind of going on the road, and when the national title game was out in Dallas, I popped in to go see Chad Morris, the new coach at SMU, and he was telling me, hey, I read your book, and my son's reading it now, and ran into Brady Hoke, the old Michigan coach in Dallas as well, and he had told me. So it's like, that's an audience I just wouldn't have expected. You always think coaches are too busy, but then again, they're on planes a lot too. But it's been fun. It's good. You don't necessarily write books for that kind of reaction, but it's always refreshing to see it because you never know. I don't know if you do this as well, but you walk into an airport bookstore and you look around and where's my book? Or you go into some of these and it's like, okay, is this place bad or whatever? I think it's probably human nature. We're all kind of neurotic about those things. Some of us probably, like me, probably more than others.
Well, you've had a number of successful books, so I think I can understand the attention to detail. Bruce, let's talk a little bit about about the overall world of college football. We were mentioning at the beginning Lane Kiffin staying at Alabama. You know Lane very well. Your reaction to that?
I think it's a smart move for Lane Kiffin, to be honest. I mean, he's still young, especially by head coaching standards, and I think one of the things that I think is really good for him is more time around Nick Saban under that system. He's going to coach elite talent. Now, I think it's going to be a challenge more in 2015 just because, they're probably going to have to replace maybe 9 starters on offense. And, there's still really good young players there. But I just think structurally it's a good thing for him. Even if he's, with Alabama for 3 years, which would be, next year in 2016, I think then, I think it kind of rehabs his image a little bit. And I think people – one thing that I saw a lot, living out here in Southern California, was there was a tendency for people, after he had a really good year, I think it was 2012, they went up to Autzen State and beat Oregon. They had a 10-win season, and people were going into the next year did a lot of Lane Kiffin has changed and he's matured and all that stuff. And I think it's hard to get people to buy that, kind of storyline again. I mean, ultimately, Lane Kiffin is who Lane Kiffin is. I'm not sure he's going to be that much different at 45 personality-wise than he was at 35. But I think in terms of just the day-to-day operation and being maybe a little more savvy in how he does things because he's seen what really works, being up close with Saban, I think those are good things. And the reality is, to see him, if he were to have left to be somebody's offensive coordinator, I'm not sure how much that would have advanced his career at all. It's a matter of would he liked to have lived in the Bay Area, would his family have liked to live in the Bay Area more than, living in Alabama. I mean, that's up to them. But ultimately, career-wise, I think he's in about as good a position now as he could ask for.
Speaking of Alabama and Nick Saban, I know you commented 2.5 weeks ago in the aftermath, or 2 weeks ago in the aftermath of the national championship game that I'll let you explain. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but as of this moment, maybe Urban Meyer has passed Nick Saban. That was a statement that 5 years ago wouldn't, or 6 years ago wouldn't have seemed dramatic, but 2 years ago, after Saban won his second and it seemed like he was on his way to his third and fourth straight, it does seem like a mouthful. Talk a little bit about the Saban versus Urban conversation, which will not go away anytime soon.
Well, I think those are the two best coaches in college football. They are 1 and 1A. If if I would right now between Saban and Urban Meyer, I think what Urban Meyer just did at Ohio State is pretty remarkable, given that, you know, 3 quarterbacks. They only had 1 offensive lineman going into this year. And Ohio State, I don't want to say they were left for dead because, I mean, Jim Tressel had won a little bit before. I know people had talked about the job Urban Meyer did at Ohio State, and, you know, they were struggling the year before. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that they were winning a lot of games and in BCS bowls. But still, the idea that they went, you know, beat Alabama in the Sugar Bowl, you know, really did a really good job containing Marcus Mariota in that offense. I mean, he had 4 turnovers and still 1 going away. I think he deserves a ton of credit. And, you know, one thing that people look at, and they're going to go, well, Nick Saban's done, you know, X, Y, and Z, and has, you know, you kind of match up stuff. Well, Nick Saban's also in his early 60s. His career is a lot further along. I think if Urban Meyer can keep up a similar level of energy, because Nick Saban just seems like he kept getting hungrier and hungrier and fine-tuning what he does. I think talking to coaches who worked with him, you know, from the time he was at LSU to the time he was at Alabama, seems like he's gotten a lot savvier in the sports psychology aspect of it and things like that. And I think he's very good at this doesn't matter, this is not on my plate, I'm not worrying about it, where I think Urban Meyer's biggest challenge is he would get eaten up by some of the things that were out of his control. I think Nick Saban's mind was in tune enough where he could just shut that off. What I think has helped Urban Meyer is he's come back with all this energy, and he seems like he's sustaining it. Now here's the harder part is, okay, now what are the problems that come with the success that you've reached the mountaintop? I mean, that's the challenge. I mean, I'm not going to, you know, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, this team was a year away. They'll probably be preseason number 1, but, you know, a lot of stuff can go wrong. But I think at this point, for what he has done, I mean, every place he has been, there haven't been any hiccups. I mean, he could have, you know, if there was a playoff with that Utah team, who knows where they would have been. I mean, that was a really good team that never got a chance to go any further than it did. It didn't play a good bowl opponent, but, you know, I think his resume is pretty, you know, pretty awesome at this point.
Chatting with Bruce Feldman. Bruce, a week from Wednesday, Super Bowl will be over, we think, and the National Signing Day takes over. And certainly Saban will be at the center of attention, but there'll be some other stories. And we were referencing the problems that Florida seems to be having under McElwain. I don't think, I'm curious what you think, you can blame it on him. Muschamp going to Auburn really helped, but give us your snapshot view of Florida and a rather slow start, at least on the recruiting trail, under Jim McElwain.
You know, I think what a lot of that has to do with is Will Muschamp was so well respected. And I know you and I both, like a lot of people in the media, watched his outgoing press conference at Florida and had never seen anything like it, where usually they don't gush about the head coach when he's getting hired as much as the president and the AD did. And I think, you know, a lot of people, including recruits, felt like that. There's kids that I think would have probably been definitely going to Florida and already would have signed with, or already would have committed to them by now if Will Muschamp was still the head coach. He's not. And so I think that there is a little bit of scrambling. There's some kids I think Florida's in. I mean, I'm writing a story for tomorrow on some of the biggest recruiting battles still out there. Florida's in the mix on a few of them. And I think, you know, a couple of those kids would be key if he lands them. But I think what you have right now is just a coaching transition. And quite honestly, when you do have a head coach who was on the hot seat, as you know, was well documented that Muschamp was, I think there's some skepticism. Are you going to buy in? I think with Florida State having won a national title the year before, there was some momentum there. And I think, quite frankly, you look at what's going on in the rest of the SEC, Florida wasn't a hot school. So, I mean, all those factors, you know, I think they're going to, come signing day, I think they're going to jump up a lot in the rankings, because I do expect them to land a couple of blue-chip kids. But this is not going to be, you know, I think people who are going to write off Jim McElwain probably need to wait till he has a full year to see what he and that staff can do.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure people will write and say, Bruce, that Florida has never been out of the top 25 or 30 since the BCS era. And that may change. I mean, all you need is a couple of 5 stars, and the dynamics change dramatically. But it is sometimes it is hard to outrun perception, as you've alluded to.
Yeah, when you're digging out of such a hole, and I think again because of it's also interesting that Muschamp is actually a lot of times when a head coach gets forced out, he's out of the picture entirely. Will Muschamp's now down the road at a school that is very desirable even before he got there. So I think that's going to be intriguing for a lot of kids who look at it and go, you know what, I would like to play for that guy, and he's at a big time school anyway. Maybe I'll just go over there, unless you have some kind of family allegiance to Gainesville.
Bruce Feldman, Fox Sports, his book, The QB, critically acclaimed by almost every critic and coach out there. Bruce, always good to visit. Thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks, Paul.
This is the best of the Paul Finebaum podcast.
I'm SEC recruiting analyst Derek Tyson here for your Paul Finebaum recruiting update on Tennessee. The Volunteers currently have the 5th best recruiting class in the country. That ranking holds up through signing day. It will be the 2nd straight year that Butch Jones has led Tennessee to a top 5 recruiting class. Tennessee has 28 commitments, including 11 which are ranked in the ESPN 300. An impressive 16 commits are ranked 4 stars or higher according to the ESPN rankings. The Volunteers have put together a strong defensive line class which has 4 commits ranked inside the ESPN 300. Volunteers have done most of their work outside of the state. Tennessee has 19 commitments from outside of Tennessee, including 7 from neighboring Georgia, 2 from Virginia, and another 2 from California. With limited scholarships available, Tennessee can only add a few more prospects in their 2015 class, and they are hoping some of the commits in this class will have as much success as prospects like Derek Barnett last year, Jalen Hurd, Todd Kelly, and Josh Malone. All were instant impact freshmen.
Okay, there you go. Butch Jones making a big impact. I remember last year on Recruiting Day, I talked to an analyst, and he said if he can just do this 2 more times, Tennessee is all the way back. Well, they're not all the way back, but they are close. Look at Gus Malzahn, certainly making a lot of impact. Mark Stoops doing quite well. Bielema as well. Those are coaches that were hired last year in a very strong year. This year, of course, it was all about Jim McElwain, and we have talked about that, tried to look at that story from both sides now, and certainly a little pushback here from Gator fans, but it's still, I still can't get away from the role of Jeremy Foley in all of this. He stands behind Will Muschamp, which most of us agreed with. It was a disastrous decision in the end, and then he praises Muschamp on the way out of town, and the Muschamp does a nice job of knifing him in the back when he goes to Auburn.
How about it? And let me just say this one more thing about Tennessee. 19 players out of state. I mean, there's 2 different schools of thought. Protect your borders or go out and steal recruits from other states. 7 coming from Georgia. I like what Butch Jones is doing there.
Well, you can't make a living on Tennessee players, and that's been proven time and time again.
This is the best of the Paul Finebaum podcast.
Ron in Ocala, Florida. Good afternoon, Ron.
Yeah, I just wanted to give you some insight on what's going on with Florida. It's not as bad as it looks.
Well, please enlighten us before we send the pallbearers down to Jim McElwain's office.
Yeah, it's looking pretty. I mean, according to the paperwork and all that, it's looking pretty bad, but it's not as bad. He just had 11 guys in, and the Fab Five of Florida, whatever, Coward, Martez, Ivy, Davis, C.C. Jefferson. Those guys, 3 of the 5, probably Florida's going to land 3 of those 5. So they'll probably end up getting Coward. It was about his mom, really. And his
well,
mom
let me tell you something,
comfortable.
Ron. Recruiting's all about momentum and perception, and you have to turn a lot of heads, because right now you may have some player out there going, man, I just heard that Florida's 102nd in the country. I don't want to go there. So you do have to work doubly hard. I agree with you. You can't judge something in the process. You have to wait till next Wednesday. Florida is a favorite to turn some of those guys, but they're also going to lose a few of those. And if they lose them to Auburn, it hurts doubly bad.
Now let me say this about what you just said about Auburn, because and don't get mad at me and don't hang up on me, because I gotta tell you what's going on with this thing.
Please do.
So Muschamp going off with T-Rob, that would have been cool and everything because they came in together. But it's more to it from our standpoint, from what we know and what we're getting, because we're right here. We get all the news. And, he went over there and did that, but he also supplied the facility. So a lot of these guys that
yeah, but let me ask you a question though. I mean, listen, you're a
possible.
Florida fan. You're deep in the woods. We look at it from 38,000 feet. I mean, as someone who doesn't follow recruiting as a vocation, I'll leave it to people down the hall. I'll check in on signing day and see what they say because I'd like to have a life. Right now, Florida is behind Vanderbilt in recruiting. Vanderbilt went 0-8 in the SEC. So you can explain it in real time, but until that number changes, and by the way, it will change next Wednesday, the program looks really bad.
It does. I mean, I'm just wondering.
And I'm asking, I mean, even with a coaching change and even with Muschamp going to Auburn, how do you let this happen? I mean, you've got professionals down there. You've got great coaches. I mean, I was the first one out of the chute. I mean, I praised McElwain more than any. I was criticized by Florida people for praising him so much. So I'm not a hater. I'm just like in shock, and I think a lot of other people are as well. What's going on? That's all we're asking.
Me too. But my question to you is, you love Foley, and I like him too. So
Sure.
My question is, looking at him, how do you allow that contract to go forward without some kind of clause to the SEC school, competitive school?
Okay, you tell me, Ron. Hold on a second, Ron. What specifically are you alleging here?
I'm saying, I'm letting you know. It's nothing to allege. These are facts. You know what I'm saying? Bottom line is, Muschamp is taking Florida for all this kind of money, and then he slided out facilities. I mean, if you look at the recruiting class, he only had 8 people. And out of the 8, he's tried to henpeck and snatch them away from us. So what I'm saying is,
well, but how was Ron? How was Muschamp supposed to recruit successfully last year when most reasonable people thought he was going to get fired? I mean, here's the issue, and I don't want to go back on anything I've already said because I'm the one who said Jeremy Foley's the best athletic director in the country. But by Jeremy Foley doing what he did and then having it blow up in his face, it's okay to praise Will on the way out of town, but who created this mess? Huh?
Oh, it's Foley's fault.
Yeah, exactly. It is Jeremy Foley. Jeremy Foley is ultimately responsible for this situation because he gambled and he missed.
And now we're paying for it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so horrible. But at the same time, with the All-Star cast, I'm telling you, and we'll land 3 of those 5, we'll be top 20.
Okay.
And
no, listen. I mean, I know what you're saying is true, but I'm just, this is really more about Jeremy Foley than it is about Will Muschamp or Jim McElwain.
It sure is. But, and my thing about the whole thing with the Foley situation is, how could you let it happen without some kind of clause? Like, how did you even fire him without doing the things you saw coming forward? I just really don't.
I tell you what, Ron. The next time I fire someone like that, I'm gonna say I'm paying you, but you're not going to Auburn. You're not going to Auburn and stealing my players. I mean, you're right. I mean, Jeremy Foley praising Muschamp boomeranged. Yeah, he's telling recruits, this guy's great. Go to Auburn, sign up.
This is the best of the Paul Finebaum podcast.
I'm SEC recruiting analyst Derek Tyson here for your Paul Finebaum recruiting update on Florida. The Gators currently sit last in the conference with only 9 verbal commitments, and 3 of which are in the ESPN 300. It's the first time since ESPN started keeping rankings that Florida sits outside the top 25 in the recruiting rankings. Florida, however, has done well recruiting the offensive line, where the Gators currently have 2 ESPN 300 commits. Florida is still holding out hopes for at least 3 5-star players and several more. They have up to 25 scholarships available, and they are hoping to use at least a majority of those. The Gators did have some impact freshmen last year, such as Jalen Tabor, Duke Dawson, and Gerald Willis, but there's still only a week and a half to go, but Florida could finish very strong if it is able to land a few of the 5-star prospects.
No doubt. A lot of conversation about recruiting as we continue. Stuck in the swamp. Yeah. Muschamp getting a lot of attention today on the show, and the question is, what would have happened had you replaced Muschamp after the 13th season, and where would Florida be today if they had stayed with Muschamp? I think the answer to the second question is nowhere. There was absolutely no support for Muschamp. So it's one of those old adages that you learn at the Harvard Business School, that if you're going to make a mistake and pay for it, do you prolong the inevitable or do you just go ahead and do it? Interestingly, Jeremy Foley, and I'm not turning him into my thesis on this Monday, actually went against one of his axioms. He's one of the people that always talk about if there is a problem and if the perception has seeped into the conversation, then it's already too late. What he did was fade the heat. I think deep down he knew he made a mistake years ago on Will Muschamp, and he really didn't want to face it. He kept hoping for a miracle, or maybe the Big Bang Theory, as Bobby put it, that maybe Will Muschamp wasn't a mistake like the planet Earth. I don't know.
This is the best of the Paul Finebaum podcast.
Adam Kramer, he's the college football writer for the Bleacher Report. And Adam, thank you for the time. It's been too long. I hope all is well. Good afternoon.
How you doing, Paul?
I'm doing great. Thanks for being on, because we can't talk about it, so maybe you can. How do you read this story from where you sit?
Well, I like you in this fight. If I'm picking sides, let me start with that. I think if ESPN is going to start flexing its muscle, that's a fight they're going to win. Now, first and foremost, I'm with you. I never liked the idea of semifinal games on New Year's Eve. Look, I don't do anything on New Year's Eve. It's not about that. It's not about plans. But in terms of tradition, well, you can mix old tradition with some new tradition by putting these games on January 1st, and I think it worked out just fine. I think the ratings were outstanding. I mean, there was no reason to shift it. So from moving the games to January 1st, I thought that made sense. Moving the games to January 2nd, sure, that's fine too. Ultimately, I think New Year's Day would be ideal. I think you will potentially see some shift, because when it comes down to this isn't necessarily about convenience. This is about dollars, it's about eyeballs. And you'll get more eyeballs on January 2nd than you would December 31st.
Yeah, and that Saturday, let's be honest, is a pretty dead day. I'm trying to remember last year in the NFL season, there may be, they may have a game or two scheduled. The NFL may play a game or two that day, but there's no guarantee the game is even watchable if they do, and they may not have any. But New Year's Eve isn't so much about the parties. It is a part work day for some people, but it's also just people are in total transition. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or 5 o'clock, depending on where you are in the West Coast, it's a weird time of the day. Let me move on from that. As you know, and as everyone knows, next Wednesday is National Signing Day. We've been talking about a story making the rounds about the University of Florida. They fire Will Muschamp. They pay him off. And then they apparently, Jeremy Foley I'm talking about, doesn't put any provision that he can't do anything once he moves on. He goes to Auburn, and I'm told by coaching friends there's usually a gentleman's agreement. If you go to another school, you're not, you can recruit, but it's frowned upon. We went through this last year with James Franklin, but not only has he gone to Auburn, he is making a lot of noise, bringing players he previously had leaning toward Florida to Auburn, and Florida's recruit. I know I'm giving you the Gettysburg Address here, but Florida's recruiting rank as of this moment, according to Rivals, is 102, which puts it behind Vanderbilt and barely ahead of Appalachian State. If you could even attempt to try to make a comment on that 975-word question I just asked you, please do.
Well, sure. Let's start with Urban Meyer. You remember when he got to Ohio State? Brett Bielema was not too happy with him. Mark D'Antonio was not too happy with him because he came in and he made a few calls out there. And I'm sorry, gentleman's agreement in recruiting, I'm not sure such things exist. We can talk about it, and it's nice to say, and if coaches want to lean on that when it's not beneficial to them, sure. But the reality, it's cutthroat, and this is a cutthroat time of year. You talk to coaches, you talk to assistants. If you can, they'll do anything to land a player because it's their job. It's their livelihood. You look at the salaries that some of these assistants are taking. You look at the salary that Muschamp is taking, the expectations of him. I have no issue with it. We talk about things about an early signing period to maybe avoid these types of things. If that's the case, then sure. But the reality, until that letter is faxed in, until the signature is there, I think these players are up for grabs as long as the kids are okay with it. As long as that's the case, and it certainly seems like they're listening to the pitch, then, again, I don't have much of a problem with it.
Adam Kramer joining us. And Adam, you have certainly had fun with recruiting. We all do. Next Wednesday, it's a serious day for some. Others laugh at the proceedings that go on across the country when young players, 17, 18-year-old, line up hats and dogs and cats and who knows what else. Give us your view from way above on how recruiting should be done.
I love the spectacle of it. I want someone to ride in on an elephant and declare that he's going to Alabama. I like the weird. I like the extreme as long as it's not necessarily, putting another team out there, to shame. If a kid is having fun, this is their day. I mean, from a football sense, this is the last time they're really going to have control of that part of it with this contract. And this is an important day for them. It's a day they've been working up for. It's a day that coaches are working up for. So from a national signing day, I love the extreme. Is it all too much? Sure it is. But the reality, it's not just one day anymore. The extreme is 365 days out of the year. So to have a little fun with it, I'm okay with it. Recruiting as a whole, I think, is certainly entered another echelon when it comes to this. I think ultimately you're going to see some, de-emphasis of National Signing Day with things like an early signing period because the coverage is so good. So if these are the last few years, the peaks of it, well, then I hope we see some things we haven't seen anymore. And more importantly, I hope the kids really enjoy it because this is their day.
Yeah, and you're right. It's the last time a lot of these coaches will even speak to them because once they get on campus, they're yelled at or instructed or some other means. Let me get some reaction from you on some of the news of over the weekend. One in particular, Lane Kiffin deciding not to go into perhaps the worst situation in all of sports, the San Francisco 49ers, and stay in what was the best, Lane Kiffin staying to work under Nick Saban. Your view on that decision?
Well, you take the pulse of Lane Kiffin on social media, and you're going to read a lot of different things, predominantly negative. That's not my case at all. I think when this news broke, people think it's Lane Kiffin, falling upward. This is a big deal for Alabama. You look at the personnel changes. You look at a situation at quarterback much like last year. You look at having to replace basically every wide receiver they have. Offensively, this team's going to look a little different. You've got a workhorse at running back that you're going to build around, but you need a voice like this. And what I loved about Lane Kiffin this year was his selective aggression. And I think that's something Alabama needed. I think we saw it in the Iron Bowl. We saw in other games where they'd be content just running the ball like they did, kind of that old Alabama identity with so many changes on the coaching staff, changes on the offense. I think, securing him was a big deal. I think that's a very big deal, especially as we approach National Signing Day and having a recruiter like that on your staff as well.
Adam, let's talk about the conversation in relation to Urban Meyer. It seems almost cliche to ask people who's better, Urban Meyer or Nick Saban. We had Bruce Feldman on earlier. He described it as 1A and 1B. But it's interesting that until recently this wasn't even a conversation. I'd pretty much declared Nick Saban the greatest coach in the history of mankind, and then that weird field goal return and the loss to Ohio State. So things have changed, but how much have they changed?
I think, this year was extraordinary for Ohio State. We've never seen anything like they've had at quarterback, and because of that, I think the conversation's going to change, and Urban Meyer certainly belongs in that conversation. 1A, 1B is accurate. I think you start this conversation with those two guys, and you take a deep breath before you get to number 3. I think that's probably the best way you could start the conversation. I think Nick Saban's the best recruiter in the world. I think he's probably the best developer of talent in the world. But in terms of game coach, I'd probably give the edge to Meyer. I don't think you lose either way. But I do think when you look back at this past season, you try to process exactly what happened. You look at the Virginia Tech game, you look at those numbers, which I have, and it's startling, and how far that team went. that's going to alter your perception. It's going to alter your legacy. I think that's kind of what we had to do with Meyer. At the same token, I look at Nick Saban, what he was able to accomplish this year. I know people view the Alabama's loss as a disappointment to Ohio State. You look at where they were before the year began. Questions at quarterback, questions at cornerback, questions along the offensive line. I think this was a really solid year for Nick Saban in Alabama, but he set the bar so high that anything short of a national championship, and it's almost a knock against him, which again, could almost be unfair at this point.
Well said. Great stuff from Adam Kramer from the Bleacher Report. Adam, many thanks. Hope to talk again soon.
All right, Paul. Thank you.
This is the best of the Paul Finebaum podcast.
Rich is next in Atlanta. Good afternoon, Rich.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for taking my call.
You bet.
Nice talking to you. I've been traveling. Hey, Paul, and excuse me if you've already covered this, but I just wanted to ask you, have you talked about Arkansas and hiring the new offensive coordinator, the head coach from Central Michigan?
Yeah, yes. We talked about it briefly on Thursday when the story came out, but we haven't dug too deep into it. What do you think?
What I was wondering what your opinion was on what this means for the mid-majors moving forward. That's like, the Power 5, the Little 5, whatever. The mid-majors, here's a guy that left on his own. He was a head coach to take a coordinator position, and he probably got, a $500,000 a year raise? What does this, do you see this as a precedent? Do you see this moving forward as bad news, I guess, for the mid-major programs?
I do, but there's no question. I mean, when you can make more money and position yourself for a better job, I mean, people leave and go to mid-majors, and certainly the MAC is a great conference, but it can also be a dead-end job. And you go to the SEC or the Pac-12 or the Big Ten as an assistant. Just look at Tom Herman, who jumped out of Ohio State after a really good year, and you take a swing, and that's what these guys want. And Central had a good program, got to a bowl game, even though it was not in this country, I don't think. And he decided Arkansas is a hot school. Go there, you win, and you get a better job. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Do you ever recall a head coach leaving to take a coordinator position in a better conference?
I mean, other than the $200,000 raise, it seems like it's happened. Although I'm struggling to. I know there's a precedent for it. Yeah, I know it's happened. Right. I'll dig it up. Exactly where and how.
Right, because Herman's the Ohio State coordinator. Yeah, he left for a head coaching job. But I just don't ever remember a head coach leaving for a coordinator's job. That's why that was my question for you today.
Yeah, no, there's no question. But if you go back, I think Central's had some really good coaches in the past. Wasn't Kelly and Jones there, I believe, or was that?
Yeah.
And they went to Cincinnati.
I remember that.
And, yeah. I mean, there's definitely been
the quarterbacks.
Yeah, there's been a pipeline, but. I mean, coaches have gotten good jobs, and apparently this guy didn't get a good job, so he took a swing at Brett Bielema, which I think is a pretty good landing spot.
Absolutely. Yeah, because were you high on the Hogs next year?
I am. By the way, and I think the stranger choice is the coach out of Tennessee who went to rejoin with Lovie Smith. I mean, he's leaving Tennessee while the program is roaring back, and now Tennessee's still looking for an offensive coordinator.
What do you hear on that?
I haven't heard much. I mean, I could give you the same speculation. There's talk about moving from within, but I think with national side, you are seeing coaching jobs filled. Alabama filled the Kevin Steele job today. You're seeing a lot of Kiffin staying, but there may be someone out there. I'm just not sure exactly what Butch is thinking right now in Knoxville.
Well, and that's his offense, too, a lot like parallel to Meyer.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, Butch Jones is the offensive guy. All right, well, good talking to you, and good to hear your voice again.
This is the best of the Paul Finebaum podcast.
I'm SEC recruiting analyst Derek Tyson, here for your Paul Finebaum recruiting update on Georgia. The Bulldogs currently have the fourth best recruiting class in the country. That ranking folds through up to signing day. It will be the fifth consecutive year Georgia has finished in the top 10 of the final recruiting rankings. Georgia has 26 commitments, including 14, which are ranked in the ESPN 300. An impressive 19 commits are ranked 4 stars or higher, according to the ESPN rankings. The Bulldogs have put together a strong defensive line class, which has 4 commits ranked inside the ESPN 300. The Bulldogs have 11 commitments from out of state, including 4 from neighboring Florida. With limited scholarships available, Georgia can only hope to add a few more prospects in their 2015 class, and they are hoping this year's class can add productive players such as Lorenzo Carter, Nick Chubb, and Sony Michel from last year.
A good report there from Derek. And Georgia just is amazing when it comes to recruiting. Exactly how that translates on the field and in the one-loss column could be one reason why we have so much conversation about Mark Richt. Nick Saban has converted recruiting to success. Mark Richt has done it mostly, but it's the off years that get the better of the Georgia fans, as well as the fact that Georgia, like Alabama, is usually favored, but they don't always win. You wonder sometimes how they ever lose as well, but they do.
I'm thinking about your SEC Nation commercial right now. You're the expert on that, building the fence around the state and keeping players within your own state. But the problem with Georgia is, and you can maybe think about it this way, there's so many great programs around that state. You have Auburn right down the road, Florida State, you have Florida, Clemson mentioned there, Alabama, of course. I mean, there is going to be a handful of programs that can come in and pick off some of the best talent.
Yeah, I mean, for those who don't know the geography of the SEC, Tennessee used to make a living there many years ago during Philip Fulmer's heyday. Auburn is, about 15, 20 miles away from the Georgia border. Columbus, Georgia is pretty much an Auburn, Georgia town. They share the affinity from the fans, and Nick Saban planted his flag down in Atlanta a couple of years ago as well, and that made a big, big difference.
This is the best of the Paul Finebaum podcast.
We head to Andy next in Perrysburg, Ohio. Andy, good evening.
Hey, good evening, Paul. Apparently it's that time again. We get to do this a couple of times a year when Florida falls flat on their face compared to themselves. And we have to go back and rehash the whole Urban Meyer left the cupboard bare. Well, Urban Meyer did not leave the cupboard bare at Florida, and certainly the way he left the program is not comparable to the way that Will Muschamp has frittered away the program there and his just towering incompetence as a head coach. I mean, for comparison's sake, he left them with the 102nd recruiting class in the country right now. In Urban Meyer's time at Florida, their average recruiting class was 8th in the nation. In 2010, right before he left, Florida had the number 1 recruiting class in the nation, as rated by rivals and everybody else. So it's mind-boggling that anybody would connect these two things together. And having experienced a few years of Urban Meyer recruiting now, I got to tell you, it's really, really nice because you already have these great classes that go into signing day. And then on signing day, instead of being disappointed by the big name who you thought was coming to your school, like Sharif Floyd, going to another school, we get these wonderful surprises. Players like Von Bell, who was supposed to go to Tennessee, deciding to come to Ohio State on signing day. And we all saw the things that Von Bell was able to do as a true sophomore throughout the season in the college football playoffs this year. So, I mean, this revisionist history, this angry crap that comes from Florida, the most bitter fan base on the planet, it should just be stopped. So I'm happy to come here and stop it on your network, typed out to all of our SEC-loving fans across the country, Paul.
Well, Andy, I am so pleased that you could make a contribution on this day of all days.
Well, this is the time of year, and, I haven't got out my abacus to figure out how many players Nick Saban signed over the past 4 years yet. That's advanced mathematics.
That's how we were first introduced to you many years ago, Andy. You called up, you railed on Saban, and you've been a fan favorite ever since.
Oh, yes, I know they love me across the Southland. You know, it was great being part of a complaint for something that the SEC then created a fake rule that's done nothing to curb the practice of oversigning. But needless to say, every time Saban signs a huge class with all these fantastic, out-of-this-world 5-stars, you know, the real happy players, the real happy recipients of all this are the coaches of your Arkansas states and your Alabama states and your, you know, all of your FCS schools down there who get to be the beneficiaries of all the cast-offs that Saban had in the last class, the class before with those high star ratings who didn't work out in our lovely system. But you know, I'll see if I can contact somebody who can execute higher mathematics better than myself to find out how hard he's pushing the envelope and how much dead wood he's chopping this year. But I imagine it's quite a bit, Paul.
Thank you, Andy. As always, good stuff. Let's go from Perrysburg to Columbus, Ohio. I'm going to have to get my Ohio geography a little brush up on that with all the calls from up there. Good afternoon. How are you?
Good. How are you, Paul?
I'm well, Josh. Thank you.
Good. Andy kind of stole my thunder here a little bit, but I heard this conversation a couple weeks ago on here, and right after the national championship, and I understand everyone was upset down there, but I went back and looked this up because I was looking at the recruiting classes. The first year Urban Meyer was there was second highest recruiting class, then first, then sixth, then seventh, and then the year he left, it was ranked number 1. So the lack of talent being left at Florida was far from what Florida fans would like to make it out to be, not even close. So the lack of them being able to get another coach is really what hindered their job. Now, I am not one who thinks the Big Ten is the mighty dominant conference. Matter of fact, my wife is an LSU fan, and she reminds me all the time that that's not the case. And I agree with that. I think the SEC, but I do think the Big Ten is moving up with the hiring of coaches. But I'd like to challenge the SEC fans also to look at one thing. Look at where most of your coaches came from. Most of the coaches that are coaching in the SEC are not from the SEC territory. Most of the coaches have been robbed out of the Big Ten or out of the North.
I hate to run, Josh, because we're up against the clock, but you're all correct. I mean, we know where a lot of them have come from, for whatever that's worth. They're in the SEC now, though.
This is the best of the Paul Finebaum podcast.
Just when you think the college football season is over, then think again. The Sports Business Journal, two outstanding reporters say breaking a story that conflicted with what Bill Hancock told us just about 2 weeks ago when he praised the New Year's Eve date, even though there had been a lot of criticism. Michael Smith, one of the reporters, joining us from the Sports Business Daily and the Sports Business Journal to talk about what may or may not be going on with ESPN, according to Michael's story, encouraging, whatever that means, the College Football Playoff Committee to move the dates off of New Year's Eve, which is not a highly rated night, to the Saturday. There's no NFL games this year because the playoffs don't begin until the next week. Michael Smith joins us. Michael, it's been too long. I hope all is well.
Doing great, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Talk a little bit about this story that you were part of today, where it is and where do you see it going?
Well, as you know, the semifinals were just a blockbuster in terms of TV audience and set all kinds of cable records, and it was a huge splash coming right out of the gates. And a lot of that had to do with New Year's Day, the Rose Bowl, the Sugar Bowl, and those were great games that drew big audiences. And what a lot of people don't realize, even today, just reading Twitter, it's interesting to see that most people don't realize still that the semifinals next year are slated for New Year's Eve. And that's a whole different dynamic from a TV standpoint because there's a much greater competition both socially and on other TV channels. And so what ESPN has done is entered into talk with the CFP officials, Bill Hancock, and also the commissioners that run the CFP about moving – this would just be a one-time deal, moving the semifinals off of New Year's Eve and on to January 2nd, where you have basically an unopposed day and evening of college football if you did that. Plus it's a Saturday.
We had Bill Hancock on here about 2 weeks ago, and it's funny now to think about what he said. He essentially said, Michael, that, what if we lose a point or two in ratings, it's not a big deal. I say that because you talk about ESPN, which, as your publication has reported and everyone acknowledges now, has spent billions and billions of dollars. So how do you think this negotiation will go? Because Hancock seems to be standing firm for now.
Right. From talking to Hancock and from talking to a few commissioners last week, it's clear that in their mind they've considered it. They've made a decision not to move off of New Year's Eve, and it's an open and shut case in their mind. Now, obviously, ESPN can be very influential, and they do have a partnership, and so I'm sure the ESPN's take on it is it's better for our sponsors. We can deliver a bigger number. The semifinals can continue to make a bigger splash. The funny thing about college football, I always say that tradition is the best friend of college football, and it's also the biggest enemy. And so, part of the tradition of college football is the Rose Bowl and the Sugar Bowl on New Year's Day. And they're not going to move, not even for the semifinals. And so that's how we wound up with semifinals on New Year's Eve and this discussion about possibly moving to January 2nd. But people need to know that 2 out of every 3 years, the semifinals are going to be on New Year's Eve, not New Year's Day.
Let's talk about New Year's Eve in the parlance of television. There's a lot of competition, period. We all know it's probably the most, I don't know how it ranks against Valentine's Day, but it's pretty serious. Go out to eat, go to a movie, go wherever type of night. And even if you are home, there's a lot of television connected to New Year's Eve. What's the guess? Your publication is at the top of the game when crunching numbers, when talking to industry officials. Knowing what it did this year on January 1st, what's the guess in terms of what it would lose by being on New Year's Eve next year?
Well, you're talking about 28 million viewers for each of the semifinal games and more than 33 million viewers for the championship game, and those are all cable records at the time that those games were played. And so there's certainly the expectation at ESPN, from what we understand, that those semifinals on New Year's Eve would suffer at safely, you could say, double-digit decreases in ratings. And so that's a concern. When you think about that day, you would have a triple header of games. So you'd have one game leading off at 12 or 1 o'clock, and then theoretically you'd have the 5 o'clock and the 8:30 semifinals. A 5 o'clock semifinal on New Year's Eve, that's tough because a lot of people work on New Year's Eve, and then they get home and they're trying to get ready to go out. And so you have a 5 o'clock kickoff, which is tough on the East Coast. Think about the West Coast where you're kicking off at 2 o'clock. It's just not an optimal situation. And, it's not great for whichever bowl game. I think the assumption is it'll be the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl that'll lead off the day with a 1 o'clock time. I mean, those are a big part of the ESPN properties too. There's other New Year's 6 games. And so you could have a 1 o'clock kickoff with the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl that's 10 o'clock on the West Coast, and on what amounts to, for a lot of people, is a work day.
Yeah, Michael, this year, I believe, my memory of that whole January 1st is somewhat fuzzy, but that Saturday, I think this year was the wild card weekend in the NFL. This year it's not. The season, the calendar is a little bit different. College football starts later, obviously, so does the NFL. I think there's one less week. So what is currently on that Saturday, which would be January 2nd, at least on the football calendar right now?
Well, the NFL's Week 17 would be that Sunday, January the 3rd. And so the NFL has not been playing games on that Saturday, January 2nd. So the expectation would be that the semifinals would have pretty much an unopposed position in those windows on January 2nd. The NFL has not played regular season games on that last Saturday since 2007. So it appears to be pretty wide open.
Okay, well, that's pretty attractive. You tell me. Listen, we've all been around these people in press boxes, and you probably spent a lot more time around them in luxury boxes. But I mean, it's not like we're talking about bringing, Obama to India, two countries that used to be friends. And now have had some tension, and you try to work them out, like we saw over the last 2 or 3 days in New Delhi. What happens? I mean, how did this conversation go? Because all these people, as most of us know, particularly people that work in your industry and mine, I mean, they're friends, they're colleagues, they have a deal in place. So how do they find accommodation on this? Is what I'm asking.
Right. Well, they're definitely. In this together. One of the things that ESPN does with its sponsors, there are 15 corporate sponsors, all of them advertise in the semifinals and finals, is they have to guarantee a certain viewership number to those sponsors. And if the games don't hit the viewership numbers, then ESPN has to provide additional advertising, which is called make good, for those viewers. So, the other thing that's interesting about this is, even though in the minds of the commissioners and the CFP, this is a closed case, certainly you expect that ESPN will come back for further talks and bring it up again. And it'll be interesting to see to what degree this is a test of ESPN's influence in college athletics. Because certainly there's that perception that ESPN is hugely influential, and they are. There's no question, especially with the money you're talking about. But this could certainly test the limits of that.
And what's in it for the College Football Playoff Committee to stand firm, to risk playing these games on New Year's Eve, and maybe they get a weird setup where the teams are not like we had this year, where you had two attractive games. Certainly there would be some egg on their face, and ESPN will have to pay the piper. So what's to the advantage of Bill Hancock and the commissioners telling ESPN, we don't care who you are, how influential you are, this is not what we want to do?
Well, the rationale from the CFP side is that they've decided for the next 12 years, now 11 years, that they're going to own New Year's Eve. They're going to own, and as they said, take back New Year's Day. And those 2 days combined are going to be a college football holiday. And so if they start moving games around off of New Year's Eve, then it makes it more difficult. It sets them back in their mind, their ability to establish that national holiday, especially on New Year's Eve. You got certainly more tradition on New Year's Day. So they feel like they need to stand firm on the New Year's Eve, New Year's Day plan that they have, triple headers on both days, in order to establish what they feel like for the long term will be a college football holiday.
Yeah, Michael, one other thing I read in your publication the other day, that the NFL is at least exploring the possibility of expanding its playoff, and one of the dates, if that happens, I don't know where it is, would be that Monday night where college football currently has its championship game. Has anything happened on that, or did I read that correctly?
That's something that's been out there for probably the last 11 months, and it's kind of a story that's flown under the radar, because it's been just a what-if kind of story. What if the NFL playoffs expand? What if they add teams? What if they might consider a Monday night? Well, that's one level. It becomes a whole different dynamic when you learn that Roger Goodell has been out, meeting with conference commissioners like Mike Slive and Jim Delaney to discuss this possibility that a Monday night playoff game from the NFL could go head-to-head against the championship game, and it speaks to the level of sensitivity, between those two parties.
Fascinating stuff. If you had to, I know you're a reporter and you're not a prognosticator, but back to the original story here that we have been talking about. What's the timeline, and what's your best guess?
Well, I believe Bill Hancock, and I believe the commissioners when they say they're not moving it. And I don't know what could be done to change their mind, but they sounded very convinced that they've already considered this and moved on. So in their minds,
it's a done deal that these semifinals are staying on New Year's Eve.
Okay. Well, the power of ESPN being tested here. Michael Smith from the Sports Business Daily. Always nice to catch up. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you for listening to the best of the Paul Finebaum podcast. Tune into the Paul Finebaum Show every day from 3 to 7 Eastern on the SEC Network or on the ESPN radio app.
Geico presents Strange Savings Stories. Astronomers detected an interstellar transmission. It stated, Geico, 15 minutes could save you 15% or more. The implications were staggering. Was the cosmos telling us we could all save hundreds on car insurance with Geico? Or did their radar merely pick up a signal from the nearby Rufus and Clyde's morning show? We may never know.
Geico, 15 minutes could save you 15% or more on car insurance.